All right, so welcome everybody. Lorraine was sharing with me earlier that since I sent out my directive yesterday, since the bishops of Alberta all sent out their respective directives yesterday, a lot of questions have been coming in. And so it was suggested to me that perhaps the best way to handle some of the questions would be to get together here and do it all at once. So I'm glad to do that, glad to be with you. Let me start this way. So the statement that I put out yesterday, the statement that the bishops put out in their respective dioceses, is really unprecedented, certainly for this province. We've not had to do anything like this before. And obviously it's due to what is really an unprecedented situation. We've been dealing in the province, we've been dealing in the country, we've been dealing worldwide with this COVID-19 virus. And it's left everybody overwhelmed, wondering what to do, how do we go through these uncharted waters and so on. Now clearly for us, the direction that we would need in order to make our own decisions within the church is that which would be given by the chief medical officer. So like everybody else, we've been following very closely the updates, the information, the directives, and as necessary, we have been instituting restrictions on the way we celebrate the liturgy in order to be in accord with what the medical officer has directed. Up until last weekend, there had been an exemption granted to public places of worship with respect to the ban that had been imposed on, for gatherings of in excess of 250 people or gatherings of 50 people when there'd be some compromised people or people at risk in the group. As you would know by now, on Sunday, that exemption was rescinded. And so the other bishops of Alberta and the Northwest Territories conferred with me Monday morning, first thing, by teleconference to discern how do we best now follow this directive. We've been following the directives all along. What further does this require of us? So we made the decision, a very, very painful one for us and for all Catholics, henceforward to cancel all masses in our dioceses, in all of our churches, not just on Sundays, but on weekdays. This is especially painful for us because the Mass or the Eucharist is center to our faith, it's central to our identity. We live for the Mass and we live from the Mass. No longer to be able to celebrate publicly and communally this sacrament, which is at the center of our lives, is for us very, very difficult. At the same time, everybody knows that we need to do this. I never thought, as an Archbishop, and I'm sure the other bishops would say the same thing, that I'd be suspending the celebration of Mass in my diocese. But again, as we listen carefully and closely to the medical officer of health, it's certain now that an action such as this is a public health imperative. And therefore we need to do it, and therefore we have done it. And it's not the only thing that we've put into place. We have directed that Lenten missions, by which a speaker will be invited into a parish and preach for a few nights to large gatherings of parishioners, that be canceled. Penitential celebrations, whereby a number of parishioners gather together in a church to reflect upon God's mercy and then go to individual confession, that's been canceled. We have stipulated different ways in which we're now going to have our priests hear confessions. Usually that's associated in the public mind with going into a confessional, and we do that on a normal basis. But throughout this pandemic, we have stopped that, and we're asking priests to hear confessions with the penitent face-to-face and in a space that will allow confidentiality, but also the requisite medical distancing between the priest and the penitent. So that'll require some adjustment on the part of some people. We also have classes of both children and adults who are preparing for certain celebrations of the sacraments in the church. On the weekend, we heard that all of our schools were closed, and so that was also an indication to us that we needed to take our own action vis-a-vis our classes that are held in our parishes. So the bishops have directed that all of those classes now for sacramental preparation cease, and any completion of the preparation would be done at home, led by the parents, with the assistance of materials provided to them by the catechists. With respect to the sacramental celebrations themselves for which they are preparing, whether it's baptism, First Communion, First Confession, Confirmation, all of those have now been officially postponed until an indefinite point in the future, after the medical officer has told us that the pandemic is in fact finished. And at that point, we'll have to confer with parents, with guardians, with other folks that are involved to determine when the dates for those celebrations will be. So there's the background. I think that writ large is what we have instituted. Clearly, we'll stay open to what directives we get from the province and the Chief Medical Officer to discern if there's any further action that we need to take. But for now, this is certainly very, very dramatic, unprecedented, difficult, but we recognize that this is what has to happen. So I think I'll stop there in terms of an introductory and get back. Any questions occur to you on this?
Have you heard how people are reacting? It's still pretty early.
It's still early yet, but I would know, first off, that the people would receive this with anguish and with pain. That would be clear. That would be natural, normal. At the same time, I have a sense across the board that people get that we need to do this. We will get frequently emails, commentary sent into our archdiocesan offices. We need to do this, we need to do more, you should be doing this, are you consider? So it's on everybody's mind. They know exactly the seriousness of this. And everybody, all of our Catholics, together with all of the citizens in the province, this is very clear, are taking this very, very seriously. Yes, it's painful, but people understand it's got to happen. And one of the ways that we're going to be receiving this particular decision about the cessation of Mass will be consistent with how we understand in our faith the place of sacrifice. This is a huge sacrifice that I'm calling on all of our Catholics to make. But we understand that when a sacrifice needs to be undertaken and is willingly undertaken and is offered to God precisely as a sacrifice, then God has a wonderful way of taking that, receiving it, and using that sacrifice to turn things to the good. So I'm asking people to take this pain, make of it an offering to God for the sake of others, in particular for the sake of people that are ill with the COVID virus. But also I'm asking them to pray for our healthcare professionals, and you know that they are working all out to the point of burnout in order to protect us. I'm asking that the prayers be offered for our civic authorities, because the pressure on them right now is something I can't even imagine as they deal not just with the outbreak of this pandemic, but its ramifications for the economy and all sorts of other considerations in our province. So they're dealing with huge pressures right now, and I think they deserve the prayers and the support of everybody.
What kind of average numbers are you looking at for Mass, I guess, at this particular church here?
Yeah, well, if you were to take the Basilica, for example, there's about 5 Masses here on a weekend. It's not unusual to have this place full, which means 1,200 plus, so that's a lot of people coming to Mass. Throughout the Lenten season, we have weekday Masses too. And people like to come and again, make their Lenten offering by daily Mass. And so you can have hundreds of people even on a weekday Mass. Throughout the Archdiocese, we've got 108 churches that have regular Sunday Mass. Some of those would be massive mega parishes with thousands for Mass. Others would be smaller, rural. And then there's a host of other churches that are served as missions on not so regular a basis. So those would be our numbers. And so we're asking a lot of people.
With your knowledge of the history of the church, have there been anything like this in the past that have closed the doors to churches?
Well, I think if you were to go back way in the past to things like the bubonic plague, Spanish flu, I think that would be comparable. Here in this province, certainly in the province's history, I'm not aware of anything that has taken place of this magnitude, which has elicited the magnitude of response from the public. And certainly with respect to the churches, no, this would be an absolute first.
How are you recommending people routine is to come and spend their Sunday morning here. How are you, I guess, recommending that they spend that time and maybe somehow get that sense of community that they have when they're here?
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that we're doing it is we're inviting people to participate in the Eucharist, if I can put it this way, remotely. So already through some of our Catholic television networks, whether that's here in the province, here in the Canada or in the US, they offer daily Mass and Sunday Mass on TV. And we're going to start this Sunday live streaming Mass here, Mass with myself, won't be with a congregation, but we'll live stream it and invite people to tune in, as it were. And they can pray along with me, they can listen to the scripture readings as they're proclaimed, they can pray with those. I'll offer a brief homily. At the key moment, of course, for people who participate in Mass is the reception of Holy Communion. And we do have a tradition in the Catholic Church of long standing that if someone were unable, for whatever reason, physically to receive the Eucharist, they can offer at that moment to the Lord what we call a spiritual communion, a prayer to Christ, asking that even though I cannot be physically present to you now, the grace that's within that sacrament, please send that into my heart at this moment. Also asking people to give some thought to how they can be praying, not just for themselves and their families, but for others, especially those that are homebound right now, especially those that might be fearful and anxious, those that might be alone. Pray for them. Consider ways in which they might reach out to them, not physically obviously, but over telephone or FaceTime or whatever might be possible. Because one of the calls that comes to us from the celebration of the Mass is to go out into the community as agents of Christ's charity. So even if we were to be celebrating Mass remotely, as it were, through the TV, there's still incumbent upon us to receive that grace and to share it with others in whatever way is possible.
The diocese in Quebec funerals today. Currently, funerals can be celebrated here in the Archdiocese.
Yep.
If the situation worsens, is that a possibility also for the Archdiocese?
Well, again, we'll have to monitor it. Our directions that we give to our people will always follow upon the best medical advice and directives that we receive from the Medical Officer of Health. I have to say that with respect to our Medical Officer of Health, I've got full confidence. She inspires a lot of trust, calm, measured, clear, certain, and so we will follow those directives. I'm obviously hoping we don't have to be even more restrictive than we are. I'm hoping that this will be the most that we need to do, but we will always stay open to what those directives are, because our first priority always has to be looking after the physical, the spiritual, mental, psychological health and well-being of our people. That comes first, and we will do together whatever we need to do to assist everybody in this province to do the same.
There's been quite a few questions online about confession, some including how do we get about booking a confession, I guess, or this one is asking about online confessions, and what about administering sacraments to people with COVID-19?
Yeah, okay, so first of all, with confession is always, that sacrament of its nature is by physical presence. You don't give absolution online, over the phone, so you have to be present. And what are the ways in which we can do that, that respect the medical restrictions that are placed upon us? Well, I've outlined those in the letter, so it's in a space that allows for preservation of confidentiality, medical distancing, and so on. People should always feel free, to go to another point of your question, people should always feel free to call the parish and ask, are you setting aside certain times for confession? They will probably post those on the parish websites and so on. I know that they're making arrangements along those lines here at the Basilica, that they can find different ways to communicate to people. What was the last part of your question?
Administering sacraments to people who...
Sure. So what I've made very, very clear to the priests is that we expect them, and they would do this naturally anyway, we expect them to be available to go to people that are in need. If someone is sick, homebound, they need Holy Communion, they need confession, they need the sacrament of the sick, yes, you have to go there. And in fact, I noticed that Pope Francis in Italy, which is living under far more stringent restrictions than we are, is saying to his priests, please don't have our people feeling abandoned by you or by the church. And we're saying the same thing. Now, truthfully, I don't need to say that to the priests. They know it. They're ready to go. What I have said to them is if you are called out to a situation like that, just make sure that you follow whatever is being directed to us medically as the proper risk mitigation procedures. Follow those, but don't leave our people abandoned.
Are the priests being given proper, if they're going to go to homes where possibly there are some contamination issues, virus issues, proper masks, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, what we would do is, first of all, we've been giving those directives not just to the priests, but to all of our parishes generally for quite some time. As we've tried to deal with the COVID virus, here's what you do, hand washing, the distancing, and all of those sorts of things. In addition to that, though, what we would say to the priests is if you're going into a nursing home, you're going into a hospital, you must, as you step in that door, immediately adopt whatever they have in place for those risk mitigation procedures, the gowns, the gloves, the mask, whatever it would take, then obviously the priest would use that.
Will there be instruction for parents to administer baptisms if this continues on?
I had not contemplated that. It's something that we could consider. That's something that would likely come to the fore if we're dealing with emergency baptisms. And if we're dealing with an emergency baptism, we're not going to leave the parents alone to do that. I mean, they would call the priest would be right there to help out. So, but that, apart from the emergency baptism situation, other things that we might do, I think we'll just have to wait a little while, monitor how this unfolds and see.
In some parts of the world where public masses have been suspended, there's been things with priests doing processions on their own. In the States, there was a priest who did a kind of drive-through confession from a parking lot. Would you encourage the priests in this archdiocese for these innovative efforts to minister the sacraments and show that the church is there for the people?
I think, again, I'd like to monitor things for a little while. I would certainly expect that any creative response that a priest might contemplate, he would bring it to me first before he would think about implementing it. But these are early days in the sense of, it was just yesterday that I issued this directive. So let's watch how this unfolds. Let's see how the people are responding, what questions come to us that perhaps we haven't even thought of yet, and then deal with them as they come in.
In all seriousness, like on St. Patrick's Day, is there anything that the churches would be celebrating for St. Patrick's?
No.
In terms of history, not the stuff that everybody does, on St. Patrick's Day, or a lot of people, but is there anything that the church does on that?
Well, the church writ large, so there's the archdiocese, there's other dioceses throughout the world that have pretty sophisticated communication systems now with Facebook, Twitter, all these things. And it's not at all unusual for parishes, churches, dioceses to be using those means to send out little histories about St. Patrick, little tweet, pray to St. Patrick. So those things happen. Liturgically, though, there'd be nothing that would happen now because we do have these very strict restrictions that we'll follow in any liturgical context.
In your letter, you had mentioned that decisions around the liturgy with Holy Week and Easter have yet to be determined. What are your expectations?
Well, first of all, Holy Week, that's the high point of the liturgical year for Christians. That it doesn't get any more important than that. And so we need to think very, very carefully how this is going to unfold over the next couple of weeks. I hope to get some further good medical advice about the situation at that time and what would make the most sense. I'm expecting that given what we're hearing about the anticipated length of this pandemic, that will still very much be what we're dealing with at the time of Holy Week, so we'll have to make the appropriate decisions in that context. But the bishops want us to wait a little bit more, get some more medical advice so that, just like we've been doing in the past, we'll do at this particular point, any decisions that we make will be based on the latest up-to-date scientific medical information that we get from our healthcare professionals.
Now, there's a question on the financial impact of the church at this time.
Well, I expect it will have a financial impact. People aren't coming to church. At the same time, though, you know, I think a lot of the people that come to church understand that this is their home. This is their faith home. And if you understand this as your home, then you will know that just like your natural home, there's responsibilities that continue to need to be met, financial and otherwise. And so I would anticipate that folks, even if they stay home for the most part, they'll recognize that their parish, which is their home, still has the need of financial support, and they'll find ways in which they can make that happen. For example, the Archdiocese has a donate button on its website, and we could receive donations through that website and then funnel them out to the parishes as directed by the donor. Some parishes themselves would have on their respective websites their own donate button. People may want to come around and drop off their envelopes. There's different ways in which that can happen. And my sense is that the more people are deeply committed already to their church and to the support of the mission of the church, they'll recognize the need, they'll get it, and they'll find ways for the church to continue to be supported.
This question has been popping up for the whole week on does this mean we don't have as much faith as we do, or things like that? Do we believe in Jesus?
Okay. Yeah, certainly this is not coming out of a loss of faith at all. This is arising simply out of a concern, which itself is rooted in faith, a concern to take care of one another in these extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And the key way, according to the medical professionals, that we care for one another is to limit gatherings. Some of the most significant, numerous gatherings that occur are in churches. And so it's incumbent upon us, because we want to care for one another, to take the appropriate measures. In fact, this is a time when faith also deepens. When people are afraid, when people are anxious, this is when I would want to invite them to remember that they are people of faith, and in faith we recognize that God has our back. God does not let us down. God draws close. He does not draw further away. He's never aloof. In fact, I was making this point earlier that we're doing an awful lot of talk these days about social distancing, which needs to happen among ourselves, as difficult as that is. But there's a form of social distancing that right now we cannot allow to happen, and that's any kind of distancing between ourselves and God. This is when we need to lift up our hearts to God, cry out to God, and trust that God is already drawing close to us. That's the reason for hope. And it's the faith understood in that way and practiced in that way that actually deepens and strengthens right now.
For people who are preparing for their first baptism or confirmation for the Easter Vigil, they're concerned about, having to wait until after this pandemic is over. Is something like a private mass to go on with that baptism a possibility? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think if we start making exceptions to this particular rule, we're going to find different exceptions and maybe even self-exemptions pop up here and there. This issue is too serious. We cannot fool around with this. This is the directive that I've put in place. This is the directive that I expect to be followed. And I have every confidence that it will be followed because everybody else understands just how serious this is. We are in this together. We have to act together on this, whether it's within the church or within society, and that's what we'll do.